Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. I'll be speaking in English and I'll be speaking slowly so that I have time for give time for the translators to translate my words. And inshallah they'll be able to, they're doing this without any written text, so inshallah they'll be able to translate it as accurately as possible, inshallah. First, I'd like to say that I'm so honored to be with you today. It's really a great blessing for me that in my life I get to travel and see Muslim communities all over the world. SubhanAllah, there are so many places where Muslims are. Indeed, there are very few places where there aren't any Muslims. I think every place there are human beings in today's world, there are Muslims, SubhanAllah. And to every community that I visit, I see the beauty of Islam and the beauty of the Muslim community. Among all of the diversity, there is a unity of spirit, and that's because of our turning towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what connects us. And it's really just whenever, we all face some challenges in all of the countries we live in. And especially if we're involved and we really care about our community, sometimes it can feel demoralizing or can feel difficult, and we get a little bit frustrated at the constant challenges. I can't recommend to you anything really better than going and visiting Muslims in other countries, because what you'll see is that every place we have people who are engaged in a very dynamic and creative way. And I've learned so much from what Muslims have done in their different societies and their different contexts to respond to challenges and continue to survive. It gives you such hope, and especially when you see that, in every generation, every year it seems that one country or another of the Muslim ummah, especially the Muslim majority countries, are in crisis. We thought Egypt was doing better, now it's plunged back into a terrible crisis. We were hopeful, now we feel really very sad about what's happening. So our feelings, our emotions go up and down as we follow the news. And if we only follow the news, at some point we're going to feel simply overwhelmed and even maybe a little bit depressed. For that reason, it's important to not only follow the news, but to see what ordinary people are actually doing, the progress that has been made. So for example, when I'm Canadian originally, and then I moved to the United States for my graduate school at the University of Chicago, and I lived in the United States for over 20 years. Then I returned just last year to Canada so I could be back closer to my family again, especially closer to my mother, who is visiting, who came here with me. She's at the hotel now, but maybe I'll bring her this afternoon. She's not a Muslim, she's a Christian, but she's, of course, my mother, and I love her. And I want to, in her old age, be close to her so I can serve her and help her in any way and keep her company. But I know that probably you heard here that Muslims in America after September 11th, we faced a number of challenges. It was quite a difficult time, and especially I found it a very difficult time because 1 week before September 11th, September 4th, 2001, I was elected for the first time Vice President of the Islamic Society of North America. After that, I served another term as Vice President and then 2 terms as President, alhamdulillah. So I spent 10 years really constantly engaging with the government, the American government, engaging with the American media, trying to help our Muslim community. And I know that probably from what you heard here, it was a very difficult time for American Muslims. We face many challenges. And many of the worst Islamophobes, many of the worst people who hate Islam are from America. And they've spread their ideas to Europe. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 of the worst Islamophobes were banned from entry into the United Kingdom because their speech is so hateful that the British government decided they didn't want to allow them into the United Kingdom. And they're from America. America is a unique country in that we have absolutely free speech, and the government defends free speech. Even the most right-wing hateful people, even people who threaten the American president, if it isn't a direct threat, but they call him all sorts of racist names, I mean terrible, they still have the freedom to say that. There's benefits of free speech, but obviously if you're a minority and you're the target of constant hate speech, it's very, very difficult, extremely difficult, and can get overwhelming. Yet, despite that, in the 10 years following September 11th, the Muslim community in the United States grew by 60%. 60%. We went from approximately 700 mosques in the United States to over 2,000 during that time. So even though you may have heard on the news about, we had some mosques that were being opposed in New York City, we had mosques that were firebombed in Tennessee, yet at the same time in other communities you didn't hear the good news, that we continued to grow. Mosques, Islamic schools, organizations. During that time we had our second Muslim member of Congress elected to the US Congress. So alhamdulillah, there's always good news. But as my brother said before, it's the bad news. News is bad news, that's what makes it news. So we focus on that, and then it can really psychologically harm us. So it's important to balance our consumption of the news with an understanding of the reality on the ground. And so things, we have some challenges, but one of my strongest experiences, what I've learned from my experience, and I really want to share with you, is to make sure that we don't focus only on the negative. And it's particularly challenging when we look at hate crimes, because of course we want to rise up and defend Muslims when they're under attack. But it can really be unbalanced. I mean, last week my daughter, she got some news on the internet and she said, "Mom, did you hear about this woman in Paris? She was pregnant, she was attacked, some people kicked her, they pulled off her hijab and kicked her." My daughter's sitting in Canada and she heard this news, she's so upset. And I said, yes, this is true, it's upsetting, but at the same time you have to realize that Muslims are a huge percentage of the French population. And I was just in France recently, and every day there are women who are walking through the streets, and women wearing hijab and traditional Islamic dress, who are working and going to school, and it's fine. So, don't take this one piece of news and be too alarmed by it. We have to do something about it, but let's not only talk to each other about, did you hear about the bad news, right? We also have to spread the good news. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Bashiru," spread the good news. He didn't say spread the bad news. And unfortunately, I think very often we spread the bad news more than the good news. And that really has a negative psychological impact. In this time today, this morning, I'll be speaking later this afternoon, but I was asked to speak about diversity and the unity of the Muslim community. And I wanted to begin with a passage from the Quran, and since the translators will be translating it into Polish and then Arabic, so maybe what I'll do is I'll give the English translation, and then this is Surat al-Rum, verses 17 to 22. So I'll just read the English translation, then they can translate into the languages for the purpose of time. So in translation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Then glorify God when you approach evening and when you rise in the morning. For unto him is due all the praise in the heavens and the earth. And in the late afternoon and when the sun begins to decline. He brings forth the living out of that which is dead, and brings forth the dead out of that which is alive. And he gives life to the earth after it has been lifeless. This way you too will be brought forth. And among his wonders is this, he creates for you mates out of your own kind, so that you might incline towards them. And he engenders love and tenderness between you. In this, behold, there are signs for people who think. And among his wonders is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and colors. In this, behold, there are messages indeed for those who are knowledgeable." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us first about the nature of creation. The nature of creation is that of constant change. Creation is constantly in a state of change. And this is what distinguishes the creation from the Creator. The Creator does not change. Allah is Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. He does not change. Yet creation constantly changes. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is our stable point. Where we live, where we move, the people who are in our lives, the places we go, all of these things are constantly changing. Change makes human beings anxious. And that is why it is so important to know what is unchanging and to firmly plant our hopes in what is unchanging so that we do not become overly anxious and overwhelmed. Change brings loss, it brings destruction, it brings death. Yet, after death, there is life. We know that we can't have anything new and good without the destruction of something old. Yet we cannot help but mourn the past. So even the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when they made hijrah from Mecca to Medina, it was a glorious opportunity. It was the opportunity to finally be able to practice their faith in a community that allowed them the freedom to practice that. In Mecca, the Muslims were under constant attack and oppression. In Medina, now this was by agreement, by political agreement, a city that embraced the Muslims and that allowed them to practice and even further develop their religion. So it was a wonderful thing. Even with that, the Muhajirun, they very much missed Mecca. They missed their homeland. And can you imagine, even someone like Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu, who had been so mistreated in Mecca. He was a slave. He was tortured in Mecca. Could you imagine how happy he was to leave to go to a place of freedom? Yet even Sayyidina Bilal used to recite poetry about Mecca and how much he missed that land, because it was his home. He missed the air. He felt the air of Mecca was clean. It wasn't like in Medina. Medina was an agricultural oasis. There was a dampness there. And he got sick there, maybe even something like a type of malaria or something like that. And he missed the clean air and the dryness of Mecca and the mountains. You know, being able to look out at the horizon and see a landscape that he recognized. He missed that. Can you imagine, you know, even with all the hardship he faced, he still longed for seeing those hills and that land and smelling that air. Because this is the nature of being human. We are attached to even the places, you know, that we've grown up in, the kind of trees, the kind of horizon, the kind of landscape, much less the people and the language and the culture. So this sense of loss and longing is something that is human, it is natural, there's nothing wrong with it, it's something we have to express. Sayyidina Bilal, who had more faith than him? Very few people had more faith than Sayyidina Bilal with what he went through to be a Muslim. Yet, you know, sometimes we forget that having faith doesn't mean that you get rid of your humanity. Yes, we recite the Quran. We recite the Quran so that Allah can speak to us. And at the same time, sometimes we need to express ourselves. We need to express our feelings. And that's what poetry and art and writing and so many other things are for. So culture is part of what it means to be a human, and our culture will be specific to our time, to our place, to our language. And that exists along with our faith and our theology and our Quran. Allah speaks to us and we also express ourselves. That is the human dimension. And without that, we are not human. If we deny that need to express ourselves, if we deny the specificity of our land, of where we've grown up, of our language, then we're denying that we're human. And there's a sinfulness in that, because we are pretending that we are closer to the divine. We're pretending that we're unchanging. But we aren't, we change. We're impacted, we develop. We respond to people and our circumstances. So there's a great danger in denying the humanity that we have. And it can lead people to an arrogance that makes them pretend or put themselves in the place of the divine, and this is very dangerous. So when someone, you know, says, well, there's no such thing in Islam as, we're all just one. We're all just one people. We're one Muslim ummah, and we should all be the same. There's a problem with that, because yes, we should be united in our focus, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in turning toward the Qibla. We should be united, but we should not be uniform, and we cannot be uniform. And if we force ourselves into uniformity, we're doing violence to ourselves. We are hurting ourselves if we are trying to force ourselves into a uniform that is not ours. Let me just pull back a little bit and talk about this idea of uniformity versus unity. The idea of a uniform people is something that is highly modern. It comes out of modernity. It is not a pre-modern term. And what I mean by modernity versus pre-modernity, you're educated people, you all understand probably what I'm saying, but for the sake of translation, I want to make sure it's clear what I'm talking about. When I speak about modernity, I'm speaking about the formation of the modern nation states. So especially the beginning of the 19th century. the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, and then many nations really came into the formation of modern nation states in the 20th century. And what do we have in modernity? We have nation states that are for a particular kind of people. This is the European reality, at least. France is the land of the French people. To be French means you speak the French language. Germany is the land of the German people. To be German means you speak the German language, and with language comes culture and history and a way of expressing a worldview. So if you think about all of the countries in Europe, they're based on a linguistic, ethnic identity. This was not the case in pre-modernity. In pre-modernity, there were simply people who were under the rule of a particular emperor, a king or a queen, and all the people in their diversity had to be loyal to that emperor. And so in pre-modernity, there was more diversity in a population than in modernity. And the modern nation states needed to, in order to try to unify the people under this new national ideology, they tried to create a model or a prototype of what the ideal citizen looked like. So what should the ideal French woman or man, how should they dress? How should their education be? How would they raise their family? And so this is when things like school uniforms came into place. All the children are dressed in a certain way. And the army, everyone in the army all started wearing uniforms, the same kind of clothes. And people in the civil service all had to wear a certain kind of dress, and if you didn't wear the right kind of jacket to work, then it's not appropriate, because there is one model of a citizen. In pre-modernity, this wasn't the case. There was far more diversity in the way people express themselves. Now, why is this relevant to us as Muslims? It's relevant because, unfortunately, many of the Muslim nations, when they became established as nation states, took up the same way of thinking. So they believed that a Muslim country, a so-called Muslim country, should have the model Muslim citizen. And you'll even find books that will have terms like this, you know, the model Muslim man, or the ideal Muslim man, or the Muslim woman, what she should look like, the Muslim nation. And there's some people who even specify in great detail what each element of the clothes should be, or each element, each aspect of the physical appearance of the people. This idea of uniformity really came in with modernity, and we saw the unfortunate situation where in some Muslim countries that decided to become secular, they decreed that there would be a secular uniform for the people. So we saw that with Ataturk, that the Turks now had to divest themselves of the traditional Islamic dress. It became illegal, and anyone in government had to wear a certain kind of uniform. And then we see that the reaction against that, when some nations became so-called Islamic nations, then they decreed that every citizen had to wear a certain kind of dress. The women had to wear a certain kind of cloak, a certain kind of scarf, a certain kind of covering. The men had to dress in a certain way. So we see back and forth between the secularists and the religious nationalists. Unfortunately, this way of thinking has pervaded a lot of the way we talk about Islam and the way we talk about Muslims. It's true, we recognize that we have different kinds of food. You know, we talk about the diversity of the Muslim ummah, we talk, oh, we have this different kind of food, and maybe some different ways of building our masajid architecture. But sometimes this talk about diversity is quite superficial. we're okay with some of the superficial differences, but as soon as we get to a somewhat more substantial difference in terms of culture or politics or outlook, then suddenly we want everyone to be back to some kind of uniform model. So I think we still need to divest ourselves a little bit of this idea of the uniformity of the Muslim community. You know, the beautiful image, of course, for Muslims is that when we pray to the Qibla, we're all praying to one Qibla, but each one of us, even if we're standing beside each other, is praying in a different direction. If you drew the line, you know, if you had a very, very accurate map scientifically, if you went at the micro level, the person that I'm standing beside, when we're praying and we're both facing the Qibla, I'm on a slightly different angle than she is. Because of course, we're both facing the Qibla, but I'm a little bit to this side, she's a little bit to this side. So we need I think there's one of the most important takeaways is we always have to remember that there's a difference between unity and uniformity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Rum teaches us many lessons. So this first is the nature of human life is one of constant change. Change is specific. It means we are in a particular culture and place and time, a particular family, and whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never changing. The next lesson is that we cannot have anything new without the destruction of something old. We cannot be, for example, be in a new land without leaving our old land. We cannot have a new family and raise our children without leaving behind our old family to some extent. What do I mean by that? It means that if we're going to give enough time to the future generation, to our children, necessarily we'll give a little less time to our brothers and sisters and parents. Still, we try to give them the right amount of time, but we cannot look towards the future without loosening a little bit the bonds of the past. Time is limited. We only have a certain amount of time. Having that balance is important. We cannot truly make the roots and the plans and develop the institutions that we need in the countries that we live in without giving up a little bit of what we left behind. I personally have faced this a number of times in my life. When I moved to the United States, I left my family behind in Canada. I couldn't devote myself full-time to education if I didn't, without seeing my family less than I had before. I was in a different land, and I needed to focus on my studies, so I couldn't always be going back and visiting them. There's a loss there. And after many years of building up and working with the Muslim community in the United States, with my decision to return to Canada, now, you know, my friends in Canada or in the United States, and the community back there, they're asking me to return to do many things, but I have to leave that behind a little bit and build more in Canada. Now, hopefully, and what I pray is that what I did there will continue. And this is always our prayer. We have to look to our time and say, are we doing something? Are we building something in a way that is not dependent completely on us personally? So that when we leave, whether it is our life is over or we have to move to another place, we've devoted ourselves to building programs and institutions and educating younger people and helping